Right now, if you dove beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf, you'd find something unexpected. Not just fish and coral, not just shipwrecks and oil rigs, but evidence of something far stranger. River valleys carved into bedrock, ancient coastlines 200 feet below the surface, the remains of freshwater systems that once fed a landscape that no longer exists. Because 20,000 years ago there was no Persian Gulf, not the way we know it today. Where there's now 90,000 square miles of salt water, there was land, a vast river valley stretching from the mountains of Iran to what's now the Strait of Hormuz. Lush, green, habitable, and possibly home to thousands of people whose entire civilization now lies beneath the waves. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make it. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check the comments and it's wild. Sydney at sunrise, Seattle at midnight, all listening to the same story about a world that drowned. Picture this. It's 18,000 years ago and you're standing where the center of the Persian Gulf is today. But you're not underwater. You're in a river valley. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which today empty separately into the Gulf, are joined into one massive waterway that early researchers called the Kuwait River. This super river flows through a broad valley flanked by hills and forests. To the east, you can see mountains. To the west, rolling plains that stretch toward Arabia. The climate is mild, cooler than today, wetter. Springs feed tributaries that create a network of streams across the valley floor. Animals migrate through seasonally. Gazelles, wild cattle, maybe even elephants. And somewhere in this landscape, humans are living. Not just surviving, thriving. This isn't science fiction. This is what the Persian Gulf actually looked like during the last glacial maximum, the peak of the last ice age. We know this because of bathymetric surveys, underwater mapping that reveals the topography hidden beneath the Gulf today. The river channels are still there, carved into the bedrock. The ancient coastlines are still visible. Even fossilized freshwater shells have been dredged up from the sea floor, proof that this was once a terrestrial environment. But here's where it gets interesting. If this valley existed, and if it was as fertile as the geological evidence suggests, then why wouldn't humans have lived there? During the Ice Age, sea levels worldwide were 300 to 400 feet lower than today. The Persian Gulf basin was completely exposed, adding an area the size of Great Britain to the available land in the Middle East. For early humans spreading across Asia and the Middle East, this would have been prime real estate. Fresh water, abundant game, protection from harsh desert climates on either side. It would have been crazy not to settle there. Yet we have almost no archaeological evidence of these people. No ruins, no pottery, no tools, nothing. Because around 8,000 years ago everything changed. The Ice Age ended, the glaciers melted, sea levels rose, and the Persian Gulf flooded. Not gradually over thousands of years, but potentially within a human lifetime. Maybe faster. Some researchers think the final inundation could have happened over just a few centuries. Imagine watching the sea advance year after year, swallowing the land your ancestors had lived on for millennia. First the low-lying areas flood, then the tributaries back up with salt water, then the main valley starts to drown. Communities that had existed for thousands of years suddenly had to move or die. Where did they go? What did they take with them? And most intriguingly, did they carry memories of this catastrophe? Stories of a great flood that destroyed the world as they knew it? Because here's the thing that keeps researchers up at night. Some of humanity's oldest flood myths come from this exact region. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written down in Mesopotamia, tells of a global deluge that wiped out civilization. The biblical flood narrative, rooted in the same area, describes waters covering the earth. Even older Sumerian texts speak of cities that existed before the flood, when kingship was lowered from heaven to earth. What if these weren't just myths? What if they were cultural memories distorted by thousands of years of retelling of an actual catastrophe? The drowning of the Persian Gulf basin, the loss of a homeland, the forced migration of thousands of people who had to start over on the margins of their former world. This is the story we're going to explore, not with dramatic music and wild speculation, but carefully, following the evidence wherever it leads. The geological record that proves this land existed, the archaeological hints of who might have lived there, the cultural breadcrumbs left in mythology and legend, and the ongoing research that's slowly pulling this forgotten chapter of human history back from beneath the waves. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's dive deep into one of archaeology's most intriguing mysteries, the Great Persian Gulf Flood and the civilization it may have erased from history. Because here's what nobody tells you about the Persian Gulf. It wasn't always a gulf. 20,000 years ago, during what geologists call the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets covered half of North America and Europe, when glaciers stretched across Scandinavia and sat frozen over what's now New York City, the Persian Gulf didn't exist. Not as water, anyway. Sea levels were 120 meters lower than today. That's nearly 400 feet. The entire Gulf Basin, all 251,000 square kilometers of it, was dry land, not desert, not wasteland, but possibly the most fertile habitable landscape in the entire Middle East. Think about what that means for a second. Take the modern Persian Gulf, drain it completely, and what you're left with isn't a barren seafloor. You're left with a massive river valley system that would have made ancient Egypt look like a drainage ditch. The Tigris and Euphrates weren't flowing into the Gulf like they do today. They were flowing through it, carving a path through 600 miles of prime real estate before finally reaching the actual ocean, somewhere near the Strait of Hormuz. Geological evidence tells us exactly what this landscape looked like. Core samples extracted from beneath the current seafloor show layers of terrestrial sediment, river deposits, plant matter, pollen from grasslands and wetlands. Not marine sediment, not ocean deposits, land. Seafloor mapping using modern sonar technology reveals the ghost of an ancient river system. You can still see the channels carved by the Proto-Tigris and Euphrates as they wound their way through the valley. These weren't small streams. At their peak, they would have created a river system comparable to the modern Mississippi or the Nile, probably bigger. But here's where it gets really interesting. This wasn't just one river valley, it was a convergence zone. The Tigris and Euphrates were flowing in from the north, draining the highlands of modern Turkey and Iran. But they were also being fed by the Karun River from the east, bringing water from the Zagros Mountains, and possibly seasonal tributaries from the Arabian Peninsula to the west, fed by monsoon systems that were more active during the glacial period. All of this water was converging in one place, creating a braided river system with multiple channels, countless oxbow lakes, extensive wetlands, and seasonal floodplains that would have been incredibly rich in resources. The climate during this period was different from what we see in the region today. Yes, it was a glacial maximum, meaning it was colder, but not everywhere. The ice sheets were concentrated at high latitudes. The Middle East wasn't covered in ice. It was cooler, wetter, and far more temperate than the desert landscape we associate with the region now. Paleoclimate data from the period shows the Gulf Basin would have received significantly more rainfall than the surrounding areas. The river systems created their own microclimate, generating moisture through evaporation, creating local weather patterns that sustained vegetation even during dry seasons. Picture this landscape in your mind. You're standing in the middle of what's now 60 meters of ocean. But 20,000 years ago, you're on solid ground. In front of you, a massive river, maybe 2 miles wide in places, flows lazily toward the distant ocean. The riverbanks are lined with date palms, tamarisk trees, and dense reed beds that stretch for miles. Behind you, grasslands extend to the horizon, interrupted periodically by groves of acacia and pistachio trees. In the distance, you can see herds, large animals grazing on the abundant vegetation. The fauna would have been spectacular. Archaeological evidence from the region and from similar glacial period landscapes tells us what kinds of animals would have thrived here. Wild cattle, massive aurochs that stood 6 feet at the shoulder, wild boar rooting through the reed beds, gazelles and onagers, wild ancestors of donkeys in enormous herds on the grasslands. Predators too, lions, leopards, hyenas. The entire ecosystem would have been as rich as the African savanna, but compressed into this single, incredibly productive valley system. The rivers themselves would have been teeming with fish, carp, catfish, barbel, species that still exist in the Tigris and Euphrates today, but would have been far more abundant when those rivers had 600 miles of prime habitat to support them. The wetlands would have attracted migratory birds by the millions. Pelicans, flamingos, storks, ducks, geese. Any human settlement in this valley would have had access to protein sources year-round, both terrestrial and aquatic, both resident and migratory. But it's the plant resources that really make this landscape special. Core samples show pollen from dozens of species of edible plants, wild wheat and barley, the ancestors of domesticated grains, wild lentils, chickpeas and peas, date palms producing massive quantities of storable high-energy fruit, nut-bearing trees like pistachios and almonds. This wasn't just a landscape where humans could survive. It was a landscape where they could thrive with relatively little effort. Modern hunter-gatherer groups in optimal environments, places with year-round resources and high biodiversity, typically need to work only 15 to 20 hours per week to meet their basic needs. The rest of their time can be devoted to social activities, cultural development, technological innovation. The Gulf Basin 20,000 years ago would have been an optimal environment, possibly one of the best on the planet. While humans in Europe were struggling to survive in periglacial tundra, hunting mammoth and reindeer in brutal conditions, humans in the Gulf Basin could have been living in relative abundance. The geological evidence for this isn't speculative, it's concrete, measurable, undeniable. In the 1990s and early 2000s, researchers conducted extensive coring operations across the Gulf Sea floor. They were mainly looking for oil and gas deposits, but what they found was equally valuable to archaeologists and paleoclimatologists. Layer after layer of terrestrial sediment. River deposits showing clear stratification, the kind you only get from seasonal flooding. Peat layers formed from accumulated plant matter in wetlands. Most tellingly, calcrete deposits, calcium carbonate formations that only form in semi-arid terrestrial environments, not underwater. The dating on these deposits is consistent. They're all from the period between roughly 75,000 and 8,000 years ago. Throughout the last glacial period, the Gulf was land, And not just any land, but prime real estate. Seafloor mapping technology has revealed even more. Using multi-beam sonar, researchers have created detailed topographic maps of the Gulf floor. And what they show is fascinating. The ancient river channels aren't straight. They meander, creating oxbow lakes and abandoned channels, the signature of a mature, slow-moving river system. In some areas, you can see what appear to be ancient terraces, elevated platforms along the riverbanks where sediment built up over millennia. These would have been perfect locations for settlements, elevated enough to avoid seasonal flooding, but close enough to the water to access resources easily. There are also features that look suspiciously like ancient lagoons and coastal embayments from when the sea level was rising but hadn't yet filled the entire basin. Sheltered areas where fresh water met salt water, creating brackish environments that would have been incredibly productive. Modern examples of such environments, places like the Chesapeake Bay or the Wadden Sea, are among the most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth. The transitional zones in the rising Gulf would have been similarly rich. Compare this landscape to other known centres of early civilization, and it becomes clear why the Gulf Basin would have been so attractive. The Nile Valley, the Indus Valley, the Yellow River Valley in China, all of these were cradles of complex societies because they provided exactly what the Gulf Basin would have offered: reliable water, fertile soil, abundant plant and animal resources, and enough stability to support large populations over long periods. But the Gulf Basin would have had advantages even over these famous river valleys. It wasn't just one river, it was multiple river systems converging. It wasn't just one narrow valley, it was a vast basin with diverse environments, from riverine to wetland to grassland to coastal. The carrying capacity, the number of people the landscape could support, would have been enormous. Conservatively, based on comparisons with similar modern environments and archaeological evidence from other fertile regions during the same period, the Gulf Basin could have supported populations of tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people. The resources that would have attracted human settlement are almost too numerous to list. Water, obviously. Reliable, year-round fresh water in quantities that would seem impossible in the arid Middle East today. Fish, shellfish, waterfowl, all easy to harvest and available in abundance. Large game animals for meat, hides, bone, and sinew. The aurochs alone would have provided enough material from a single kill to support a family for weeks. Plant resources both gathered and potentially cultivated. The wild progenitors of wheat and barley were growing here naturally. All humans had to do was harvest them. But there were other resources too, ones that might seem less obvious, but would have been crucial for technological development. Reeds from the wetlands could be woven into baskets, mats, even boats. The bitumen, natural asphalt that seeps from geological formations in this region, was available here. Mesopotamian civilizations later used bitumen extensively as waterproofing and adhesive. Earlier humans in the Gulf Basin would have had access to the same material. Flint and chert for stone tools, eroding from the highlands and washing down in the rivers. Clay deposits along the riverbanks, perfect for pottery once that technology developed. Most importantly, the Gulf Basin would have offered something that's harder to quantify, but equally valuable: stability. Climate records show the region experienced less dramatic climate fluctuation than many other parts of the world during the glacial period. While northern latitudes were being repeatedly overrun by advancing and retreating glaciers, while the Sahara was oscillating between grassland and desert, the Gulf Basin remained relatively constant, wetter during some periods, slightly drier during others, but always fundamentally habitable. For humans trying to establish long-term settlements, this kind of stability is crucial. You can't develop complex social structures, technological innovations or cultural traditions if you're constantly being forced to migrate by environmental crises. You need a home base, a place reliable enough to invest in, to build upon, to pass down to subsequent generations. The Gulf Basin would have been that kind of place. Think about what that means for human cultural development. You have a landscape that can support large populations without requiring them to disperse or migrate seasonally. You have abundant resources that can be stored, allowing people to build up surpluses and develop more complex economies. You have stability, letting knowledge and traditions accumulate over generations rather than being lost each time a group is forced to move. You have diverse environments close together, encouraging specialization and trade between groups. Some communities focusing on fishing, others on hunting, others on plant gathering, all exchanging goods and information. These are exactly the conditions that, everywhere else in the world, led to the development of complex societies. Agriculture, pottery, permanent architecture, social stratification, specialized crafts, all of these innovations emerge when human populations have the resources, stability, and social networks to support them. The Gulf Basin 20,000 years ago had all of these prerequisites. Not in the future, not potentially, but right then. So here's the question that should be keeping archaeologists awake at night. If all the conditions for complex human societies existed in the Gulf Basin for thousands of years during the last glacial period, why do we assume nothing significant developed there? Why do we act like human civilization only began 10,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, when the environmental conditions for civilization existed in the exact same region 20,000 years ago, just 120 meters lower? The only reason we don't have evidence of what happened there is because we can't look. It's underwater. It's been underwater for 8,000 years, buried beneath meters of marine sediment, impossible to excavate with current technology. But the landscape was real. The resources were real. The potential was real. And humans were definitely in the region. We know that from archaeological sites in the surrounding areas, on land that stayed above water, even during the glacial maximum. So what happened in the valley itself? Who lived there? What did they build? What did they accomplish during those thousands of years when the Gulf was the most fertile landscape in the Middle East? We're about to find out. Or at least, we're about to explore what might have been possible. So we know the Persian Gulf Basin was dry land for thousands of years. We know it was green, well-watered, probably paradise compared to the harsh environment surrounding it. But here's the question that keeps archaeologists awake at night. Who lived there? 'Cause here's the thing about prime real estate. Humans always find it. You don't leave a fertile river valley empty when everyone around you is struggling to survive in marginal territories. It doesn't work that way. It has never worked that way in the entire history of our species. To understand who might have been living in the Gulf Basin, we need to talk about human migration patterns in the Middle East. And the timeline is absolutely wild. Modern humans left Africa around 60,000 years ago. We know this from genetic evidence, from archaeological sites, from the trail of stone tools and campfires they left across the Arabian Peninsula. That first wave of migrants following the coast, moving east toward Asia, they would have walked right past the Gulf Basin, or more accurately right through it. Because 60,000 years ago, sea levels were about 80 meters lower than today. The Gulf wasn't just partially exposed, it was completely dry, a massive river valley cutting through the landscape, fed by the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, and dozens of smaller rivers we don't even have names for anymore. Those early migrants, the ones carrying the genetic lineage that would eventually populate all of Asia and Australia, they would have seen this valley. They would have explored it, and at least some of them, maybe many of them, would have stayed. Think about it from their perspective. You're part of a small band of modern humans, maybe 30 or 40 people, moving east along the coast of Arabia. You've been travelling for generations, following game, looking for better territories. The landscape around you is harsh. Desert to the north, rocky coasts with limited resources. Then suddenly you come upon this massive river valley. Lush vegetation, abundant game, fresh water as far as you can see. You'd be crazy to keep walking. So they stayed, not all of them. Migration continued east, we know that from the archaeological record in Asia and Australia. But some groups, maybe many groups, would have settled in the Gulf Basin, set up camp, started exploiting the incredible resources available there. Over the next 50,000 years, that population would have grown, developed their own cultures, created their own technologies, become distinct from the groups that had kept moving. By the time we get to 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum when sea levels were at their lowest point, the Gulf Basin would have been home to potentially tens of thousands of people, maybe more. This wasn't some marginal refuge where a few hardy souls barely survived. This was prime territory, the kind of place where human populations thrive and multiply. But what kind of people were they? What level of social and technological sophistication had they achieved? To answer this, we need to look at what was happening in the regions around the Gulf, because while we can't excavate sites that are now under 50 meters of water, we can examine settlements that were nearby at similar time periods, living under similar conditions. And what we find is absolutely fascinating. In the Zagros Mountains, which form the eastern edge of the Gulf Basin, archaeologists have found evidence of human occupation going back over 40,000 years. These weren't just temporary camps. These were substantial settlements with evidence of repeated occupation over thousands of years. Cave sites like Shanidar in modern Iraq show continuous human presence from 65,000 years ago right up to the Neolithic period. The people living there were sophisticated hunters and gatherers. They had complex stone tool technologies. They created art. They buried their dead with what appears to be ritual significance. Most importantly, they were exploiting a wide range of resources: plant foods, hunted game, fish from rivers, birds, even systematic collection of wild grains. These mountain people were living in a challenging environment: cold winters, limited growing seasons, resources that varied dramatically from season to season. Yet they thrived there for tens of thousands of years. Now imagine their cousins living down in the Gulf Basin. Same genetic stock, same basic technological toolkit, but living in an environment that was dramatically more favourable. Warmer climate, year-round water, abundant game, rich plant resources. They wouldn't have been struggling to survive. They would have been living well. And when humans live well, when they're not spending every waking moment just trying to get enough calories to make it through another day, they innovate. The archaeological evidence from the surrounding regions supports this. By 15,000 years ago, just before the Gulf started flooding, we see an explosion of cultural sophistication in the Middle East. The Natufian culture in the Levant, just west of the Gulf Basin, shows clear evidence of semi-permanent settlements. These people were still hunter-gatherers, but they were living in substantial villages, building permanent structures, creating elaborate burial sites, developing what archaeologists call complex hunter-gatherer societies. They were on the verge of agriculture, In fact, some researchers think they had already started systematically managing wild grain populations, planting and harvesting in ways that would eventually lead to full domestication. The Natufians had grinding stones for processing seeds, sickle blades for harvesting grains, storage pits for preserving food through seasons. They were developing all the technologies and practices that would be necessary for the Neolithic revolution, the transition to farming that would transform human society. But here's what's crucial. The Natufians weren't living in paradise. They were in the Levantine Hills, a decent enough environment, but with real challenges. Seasonal droughts, limited water sources, food shortages in bad years. The Gulf Basin would have been better, dramatically better. More water, more consistent resources, larger territories suitable for permanent settlement. So, if the Natufians living in less favourable conditions were developing proto-agricultural practices, what were the Gulf Basin people doing? Some researchers think they were ahead of everyone else, that the Gulf Basin might have been the real birthplace of agriculture, not the Levant. That the people living there were the first to make the transition from hunting and gathering to systematic food production. The logic is compelling. Agriculture develops when you have the right combination of factors: suitable wild plants that can be domesticated, a climate that supports year-round or near year-round growing, population density high enough that intensifying food production makes sense, and enough surplus resources that people can afford to experiment. The Gulf Basin had all of this. Wild relatives of wheat and barley growing naturally, rivers providing year-round irrigation, potentially dense populations taking advantage of the rich environment, and most importantly, enough food security that groups could risk the multi-year investment that domesticating plants requires. If agriculture did develop in the Gulf Basin first, it would explain some puzzling features of the archaeological record. Like why domesticated crops appear so suddenly in the Middle East around 10,000 years ago. Like why early farming communities seem to already have sophisticated knowledge of plant management when they first appear in the archaeological record. Maybe they weren't starting from scratch. Maybe they were refugees from the Gulf Basin, carrying knowledge and technologies developed over thousands of years in the flooded valleys, bringing their agricultural practices with them when the waters forced them to migrate. The genetic evidence supports this possibility. Modern Middle Eastern populations show complex ancestry patterns that suggest multiple waves of migration and population mixing in the early Holocene, right around the time the Gulf was flooding. Population geneticists have identified something they call the basal Eurasian lineage, a genetic signature that appears in early Middle Eastern populations but doesn't match the main waves of migration out of Africa. It's as if there was a ghost population, a group that split off from the main migration routes very early, lived in isolation for thousands of years, then suddenly reappeared and mixed back into the broader Middle Eastern gene pool. The timing matches perfectly with the Gulf flooding. A population isolated in the Gulf Basin for 40,000 or 50,000 years would have developed distinct genetic signatures. When the floods came, forcing them to migrate into surrounding territories, they would have mixed with existing populations, leaving exactly the kind of genetic signal we actually see. But even if they weren't the first farmers, the Gulf Basin people would have been sophisticated in other ways. Living in such a favourable environment for so long, they would have developed complex social organisations. Small hunter-gatherer bands don't need much social structure. Everyone knows everyone. Leadership is informal. Decisions get made through consensus. But when populations grow, when settlements become permanent or semi-permanent, when you have hundreds or even thousands of people living in the same region, You need more complex social systems. You need ways to resolve disputes, systems for distributing resources, methods for coordinating large-scale activities like communal hunts or construction projects, leadership structures that can make decisions affecting entire communities. The Gulf Basin would have been perfect for developing these kinds of complex societies. The abundance of resources would have supported larger populations. The river systems would have encouraged long-distance communication and trade. The stable environment would have allowed multi-generational accumulation of knowledge and cultural practices. We can infer some of this from the subsistence strategies they must have employed. The Gulf Basin wasn't uniform. It was a diverse landscape with multiple ecological zones. The river channels themselves would have been incredibly productive. Fish, waterfowl, freshwater shellfish, riparian forests providing fruits, nuts and game. The floodplains would have been perfect for wild grains and other seed-bearing plants. Away from the rivers, you'd have had grasslands supporting herds of gazelle, wild cattle, onager, marshlands with their own distinct resources, upland areas where the valleys transition to the surrounding plateaus. Exploiting all these different zones efficiently would have required detailed, ecological knowledge passed down through generations. Seasonal rounds where groups moved between resource patches at optimal times. Trade networks allowing groups specializing in different resources to exchange goods. This is the signature of what anthropologists call logistical mobility. Complex movement patterns designed to maximize resource extraction from diverse environments. It requires planning, coordination, and most importantly, sophisticated communication. By 15,000 years ago, the people of the Gulf Basin would have been master environmental managers. They would have known every edible plant, every animal migration route, every seasonal variation in resource availability. They would have had technologies optimized for their specific environment, social networks spanning hundreds of miles, knowledge systems capable of transmitting detailed information across generations. They might even have been creating art, engaging in the kind of symbolic behavior that marks truly modern human cognition. We found cave art from this period in Europe, rock carvings in Arabia, decorated objects across the Middle East. There's no reason to think the Gulf Basin people were any different. In fact, they might have been ahead of the curve. Some of the earliest evidence of symbolic behavior in the Middle East comes from sites around the edges of what would have been the Gulf Basin. Shell beads from 100,000 years ago, ochre for body painting, carefully crafted ornamental objects with no practical function beyond being beautiful. These weren't primitive people barely surviving in a harsh world. These were fully modern humans, with the same cognitive capabilities we have today, living in an environment that allowed them to develop and refine complex cultures over tens of thousands of years. And then the waters came, not all at once, not in a single catastrophic flood, but over centuries and millennia the sea levels rose. The lowest parts of the basin flooded first, then year by year the waters crept higher. River valleys that had been home to thriving communities became brackish estuaries, then shallow bays, then open sea. The people living there would have had no choice but to move, to migrate into the surrounding highlands, carrying with them everything they had learned, everything they had developed, all the knowledge accumulated over 50,000 years of living in paradise. But where they went, and what happened when they got there, that's where the story gets really interesting. Because those refugees, those survivors of the Great Flooding, they didn't just disappear. They transformed the ancient Middle East, bringing with them technologies and knowledge that would spark the Neolithic Revolution and set the stage for the first civilizations. The question isn't whether the Gulf Basin was inhabited. Of course it was. Prime territory is never empty, not in the human story. The question is what they achieved there, what they learned, what they created during those thousands of years in paradise. And that answer is hidden beneath 50 meters of water, waiting for us to develop the technology and courage to go looking for it. For thousands of years they had lived in the valley, generation after generation, building a life in what was probably one of the most fertile regions on Earth. The rivers flowed year-round, fed by melting glaciers thousands of miles away. The soil was rich, the hunting was good, and the climate was temperate enough to support large permanent settlements. They had no reason to think any of this would change, but everything was about to change. Around 18,000 years ago, something happened that would reshape the entire planet. The ice began to melt. Not slowly, not gradually, but in pulses of warming that would make modern climate change look gentle by comparison. The great ice sheets that had covered vast portions of North America, Europe, and Asia began their retreat, and all that water, millions of cubic kilometers of ice that had been locked up on land for tens of thousands of years, had to go somewhere. It went into the oceans. Sea levels began to rise. At first, the change would have been imperceptible to anyone living through it. Maybe a few centimeters per year, the kind of variation you'd attribute to seasonal rainfall or tidal patterns. But this wasn't seasonal. It was relentless. Year after year, decade after decade, century after century, the water kept coming. And for the people living in the Persian Gulf Basin, what had been their greatest blessing, living in the lowest, richest, most well-watered valley in the region, was about to become their doom. Picture the geography for a moment. The Persian Gulf today is relatively shallow, averaging only about 50 meters deep. But during the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were 120 meters lower than they are now, there was no Persian Gulf, just a massive river valley, roughly the size of Great Britain, carved by the combined flows of the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, and several other rivers that converged in what is now the deepest part of the modern Gulf. This valley system stretched from the mountains of modern-day Iraq and Iran all the way to the Strait of Hormuz, where the river finally reached the ocean. For the people living there, it was paradise. Fresh water everywhere, fish-rich rivers, fertile floodplains perfect for early agriculture or wild grain harvesting, diverse ecosystems ranging from riverine forests to grasslands supporting massive herds of animals. Archaeological sites around the periphery of the modern Gulf suggest this region supported substantial human populations, but we find almost nothing from the valley floor itself. Because it's all underwater now. The flooding didn't happen all at once. This is important to understand. We're not talking about a single catastrophic event like a dam bursting, though there were episodes like that. We're talking about a process that unfolded over roughly 10,000 years, from about 18,000 to 8,000 years ago. But within that long timeline, there were periods of relatively slow change punctuated by rapid, catastrophic, flooding events that would have seemed like the end of the world to anyone experiencing them. The first phase, from 18,000 to about 14,000 years ago, would have been manageable. Sea levels were rising, but slowly enough that communities could adapt. Maybe you noticed the river channels were getting wider, carrying more water. Maybe coastal settlements had to move inland a few kilometers over several generations. Inconvenient, but not catastrophic. People could adapt, rebuild, relocate to slightly higher ground. Life continued. Then came Meltwater Pulse 1A. Around 14,600 years ago, something caused massive sections of ice sheets to collapse. We're still not entirely sure what triggered it, probably a combination of warming temperatures and ice sheet instability, but the result was unprecedented. Over a period of just 400 to 500 years, sea levels rose by 16 to 25 meters. That's roughly 4 to 6 centimeters per year on average, but the rise wasn't steady. Geological evidence suggests there were brief periods within this pulse when sea levels jumped by several meters in just a few decades. For people living in the Persian Gulf basin, this would have been terrifying. Imagine you're a child in one of these valley settlements. Your grandparents talk about how the water used to be farther away, how certain fishing spots their parents used are now permanently submerged. But it's always been a gradual thing, something that happens so slowly you barely notice year to year. Then suddenly everything accelerates. Within your lifetime, perhaps within just a few years, the landscape transforms. The lower valley where several settlements used to be is now a shallow lake. The river channels have merged into something more like an inland sea. Entire territories that people had occupied for thousands of years are simply gone, swallowed by rising water that shows no sign of stopping. This would have forced massive population displacements. People living in the lowest parts of the valley would have had no choice but to move, and they couldn't just move a few kilometers up the valley. They had to relocate to completely different regions, probably competing with populations already established in higher elevations. This kind of forced migration creates conflict. Resources that had been adequate for existing populations suddenly have to support refugees as well. Archaeological evidence from sites around the Persian Gulf periphery shows signs of increased fortification and defensive structures appearing around this time. People were preparing for violence. But Meltwater Pulse 1A was just the beginning. After that initial, catastrophic rise, things stabilized for a few thousand years. Sea levels continued rising, but more slowly, giving populations time to adjust to the new normal. The Persian Gulf basin was definitely flooding now, with water advancing from the south where the Indian Ocean was breaking through the Strait of Hormuz. But it was advancing slowly enough that people could track its progress, could plan their migrations, could maintain some kind of social continuity, even as they abandoned ancestral territories. Then came the Younger Dryas, a period between about 12,900 and 11,700 years ago, when global temperatures suddenly dropped again. It was like the climate hit pause on the melting. For over 1,000 years the ice stopped retreating. Sea level rise slowed dramatically. For the people living around what was now becoming a genuine inland sea, this might have seemed like a reprieve. The water wasn't advancing anymore. Communities could stabilize, establish new settlements, rebuild trade networks disrupted by the earlier flooding. But it was a false hope, because when the Younger Dryas ended, the melting resumed with a vengeance. Around 11,700 years ago, temperatures shot up again. The ice sheets, weakened by the previous warming period, collapsed even faster this time. Between 11,500 and 8,000 years ago, sea levels rose another 50 meters or more. This was the period when the Persian Gulf basin really filled up. Geological cores taken from the floor of the modern Persian Gulf tell a clear story. Around 11,000 years ago, you see a transition from freshwater river sediments to brackish water deposits. The ocean was breaking into the valley. By 10,000 years ago, fully marine sediments appear. The Persian Gulf as we know it was forming, and by 8,000 years ago it had reached approximately its modern configuration. That's 3,000 years for the entire valley to flood. Think about what that means. On average, the waterline was advancing about 1.5 kilometers per year. But again, this wasn't steady. geological evidence points to periods of rapid transgression. That's the technical term for ocean water flooding onto land, punctuated by periods of relative stability. There were probably multiple episodes when communities experienced catastrophic flooding as the water suddenly surged forward, advancing kilometers in just a few months or years. What would these flooding events have looked like on the ground? We can reconstruct this from modern analogies and geological evidence. The Persian Gulf basin during the flooding period wouldn't have looked like a nice clean shoreline advancing steadily inland. It would have been a chaotic mess of marshlands, lagoons, temporary islands, and shifting river channels. As the ocean pushed north, it would have backed up the major rivers, creating vast wetlands that expanded and contracted seasonally. During flood seasons, the rivers swollen with mountain snowmelt would push back against the advancing ocean, temporarily halting its progress. During dry seasons, the ocean would surge forward again. For people trying to live in this transitional zone, it would have been nearly impossible to establish permanent settlements. Any village built near the water would be subject to seasonal flooding. Any fields planted would be periodically inundated with salt water, destroying crops. The fish populations would have been in chaos too, with freshwater species being replaced by marine species, disrupting traditional fishing practices. The archaeological invisibility of this period makes sense. Who would try to build permanent structures in a landscape that was transforming every year? But here's what makes this particularly catastrophic: the speed of certain flooding episodes. Recent geological studies have identified what researchers call marine incursion events, periods when ocean water broke through natural barriers and flooded large areas rapidly. One such event probably occurred around 9,000 years ago, when rising sea levels finally breached the natural dam at the Strait of Hormuz. Before this, the Persian Gulf basin might have been a series of lakes and marshlands, fed by rivers and by periodic ocean water seeping over or through the barrier. When the barrier finally gave way, ocean water would have poured in like a bathtub filling. Hydrological modelling suggests that during such an event, water levels in the northern Gulf could have risen by several meters in a matter of months. If you were living in a settlement on what you thought was safe high ground, you might wake up one season to find the water has suddenly advanced kilometers inland overnight. Your fishing grounds are gone. Your fields are submerged. The game animals you depended on have fled. You have no choice but to pack up everything you can carry and move, probably joining thousands of other refugees doing the same thing. This kind of flooding has analogues in recorded history. The flooding of the Black Sea, which some researchers think occurred around 7,500 years ago, shows similar patterns. Initially a freshwater lake, the Black Sea was suddenly inundated when rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosphorus Strait. Geological evidence suggests water poured through the breach at about 50 cubic kilometers per day, essentially a waterfall 200 times larger than Niagara Falls running continuously for months. The shoreline advanced at about 5 kilometers per day. Anyone living on the shores of the freshwater lake would have had no time to salvage anything. They would have run. The Persian Gulf flooding probably included several events of similar magnitude, though perhaps not quite as catastrophic as the Black Sea. But even if we assume a more gradual filling, the total transformation of the landscape was as complete. Within the span of perhaps 100 to 150 human generations, an area the size of Great Britain went from habitable land to open ocean. Every settlement that had existed in that valley, every village and camp and ceremonial site, every workshop where stone tools were made and every hearth where families gathered, all of it now lies beneath 30 to 50 meters of water, covered by thousands of years of marine sediment. If there were large populations living in the Gulf basin before the flooding, and the environmental evidence suggests there should have been, then we're talking about one of the largest forced migrations in human prehistory. Tens of thousands of people, possibly hundreds of thousands over the full duration of the flooding period, would have been displaced. They would have moved in all directions, north up the Tigris-Euphrates Valley into Mesopotamia, east into what is now Iran, west into the Arabian Peninsula, perhaps even by boat to the distant shores of India or East Africa. And they would have carried stories. When you're forced to abandon your homeland because the waters are rising unstoppably, that's the kind of trauma that gets encoded in cultural memory. That's the kind of event that gets passed down through oral traditions for generations, getting embellished and transformed over time but retaining a core truth. The world was once different, and then the waters came. The flooding of the Persian Gulf wasn't unique. Similar events were happening all over the world during this period. The Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia, an even larger exposed continental platform during the Ice Age, was flooded around the same time, submerging an area twice the size of India. The North Sea formed as water flooded the lowlands between Britain and continental Europe. The Gulf of Mexico expanded northward. The English Channel opened. But the Persian Gulf flooding is special for several reasons. First, it happened in a region that we know supported human populations, because we find archaeological sites all around its periphery. Second, it occurred during a crucial period in human history, right when agriculture was developing in the Fertile Crescent. The timing is almost too perfect. Major agricultural innovations began appearing in the Levant and Mesopotamia between 10,000 and 8,000 years ago, exactly when the Gulf was flooding most rapidly. Coincidence? Or were refugees from the flooding valley bringing knowledge and technologies they had developed during generations of managing seasonal flooding and seasonal resources? Third, and perhaps most intriguingly, the Persian Gulf region becomes the geographical center of some of humanity's earliest civilizations just a few thousand years after the flooding ends. Sumer, generally considered the world's first urban civilization, arose in southern Mesopotamia around 4,500 BCE. This is essentially the northern shoreline of the ancient Persian Gulf basin. Were the Sumerians descendants of Gulf Basin refugees? Did their mythology of paradise lost and great floods reflect actual ancestral memories of the drowned landscape to their south? We'll probably never know for certain. But what we do know is that the flooding of the Persian Gulf was one of the most dramatic environmental transformations in human history. It wasn't just land becoming sea. It was the destruction of what might have been a cradle of human civilization, a place where substantial populations had lived and developed for thousands of years. And it happened fast enough that people living through it would have recognized it as a catastrophe, would have understood that their world was ending, would have told their children about the homeland they had lost to the rising waters. Those stories might still echo in our oldest myths. But first, let's look at what happened to the survivors. Where did they go? And what did they carry with them from the drowned world? Now here's where the story gets really interesting, because if the Persian Gulf really did flood catastrophically around 8,000 years ago, drowning a thriving human settlement in a matter of decades or centuries, you'd expect someone to remember. And here's the thing, they did. The oldest written stories we have, the very first narratives that humans bothered to carve into clay tablets, are about floods. Not just any floods, the flood. A world-ending deluge that destroyed everything. That drowned civilization itself. Coincidence? Maybe. but the details are too specific, too geographically concentrated, too consistent across cultures to ignore. Let's start with a big one, the Epic of Gilgamesh. This isn't some obscure text that scholars dug up from a forgotten library. It was the blockbuster of the ancient world. Copies have been found from Turkey to Egypt, written in multiple languages, spanning more than 2,000 years of continuous popularity. People in the ancient Near East loved this story the way modern audiences love Star Wars. And right in the middle of Gilgamesh's adventures, there's a flood narrative that will sound very familiar. Gilgamesh, the hero king of Uruk, is searching for immortality. His quest leads him to Utnapishtim, the only human who ever achieved eternal life, and Utnapishtim tells him why. The gods decided to destroy humanity with a flood. No specific reason given in most versions, just divine caprice. The gods got annoyed with human noise and decided to wipe the slate clean. But one god, Ea, the god of fresh water and wisdom, warned Utnapishtim. He told him to build a boat. Not just any boat, a massive vessel. The dimensions are given precisely in the text. A cube, 120 cubits on each side, roughly 180 feet, 7 decks, 9 compartments on each deck. Utnapishtim is instructed to tear down his house and use the materials, to abandon his possessions and save life instead, to take, aboard the seed of all living things. So he does. He builds the boat in 7 days, loads it with his family, his craftsmen, animals of every kind, and all his wealth. Then the storm comes. And this is where the description gets specific, really specific. The kind of specific that doesn't sound like mythological embellishment. It sounds like someone describing something they'd actually witnessed. The text says the storm came from the south. That 6 days and 6 nights the wind and flood raged. That the storm flattened everything like a battle. That even the gods were terrified by the destruction they'd unleashed. On the 7th day, the storm subsided. Utnapishtim opened a hatch and looked out. The entire world was flat as a rooftop. All of humanity had turned to clay. The boat came to rest on a mountain. Mount Nimush, the text says. Utnapishtim sent out birds to test for dry land. First a dove, which found no resting place and returned. Then a swallow, same result. Finally a raven, which didn't come back. The waters had receded. Now, here's what's fascinating. The Epic of Gilgamesh exists in multiple versions. The oldest complete version we have dates to around 1800 BCE, but fragments of earlier versions go back to at least 2100 BCE. And the flood story itself is even older, because before it was part of Gilgamesh, it existed as a standalone narrative. The Atrahasis epic, dating to around 1800 BCE, tells an expanded version of the same story, but even that isn't the original. The Sumerian flood myth, written in Sumerian rather than Akkadian, predates both by centuries. The oldest fragments we have date to around 2000 BCE, but the language and style suggest the oral tradition goes back much further. These Sumerian versions are remarkable because they contain even more specific geographic and environmental details. They don't just mention a flood. They describe the world before the flood, cities along rivers, agricultural settlements, trade networks, civilization. Then they describe the destruction. Water rising from both the Persian Gulf and from rain. A flood that lasted 7 days and 7 nights. Survivors who rebuilt civilization after the waters receded. And here's the kicker. The Sumerian king list, another ancient document, divides history into 2 eras, before the flood and after the flood. Kings who ruled before the flood are given impossibly long reigns, clearly mythological. But kings after the flood, their reigns become progressively more realistic, historical, as if the king list is marking the boundary between mythological deep time and actual historical memory. The flood isn't just a story in Sumerian tradition, it's the dividing line between legend and history, between the ancient world and the world we know. It's year zero for Mesopotamian civilization. Now, you might be thinking, okay, ancient Mesopotamians had flood myths. So what? Floods happen, rivers overflow, storms cause devastation. Why assume this refers to one specific event? Because of how widespread and consistent the stories are. The biblical flood narrative, it's basically a Hebrew retelling of the Mesopotamian tradition. Genesis was written down around the 6th century BCE, but the stories it contains are much older, and the parallels to Gilgamesh are impossible to miss. God decides to destroy humanity. One righteous man, Noah, is warned. He's instructed to build an ark with specific dimensions, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. 3 decks. He's told to bring his family and breeding pairs of all animals. The flood comes. Rain for 40 days and 40 nights. The ark floats for months. Eventually it comes to rest on a mountain. Mount Ararat in the Hebrew tradition. Noah sends out birds, first a raven, then doves, to test for dry land. When the waters recede, God promises never to flood the world again. The story is so similar to Gilgamesh that scholars universally recognize it as deriving from the same tradition. The Hebrew version was probably adapted during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, when Jewish scribes would have been exposed to Mesopotamian flood narratives. They took the story and modified it to fit their monotheistic theology, but the core narrative, the sudden catastrophic flood that destroyed the world, that stayed the same. And it's not just Mesopotamian and Hebrew sources. Persian traditions contain flood narratives too. The Avesta, the ancient Zoroastrian texts, describe Yima, the first king, who was warned by Ahura Mazda about a coming winter that would destroy all life. Yima was instructed to build a vara, an underground refuge where he preserved humans, animals, and plants. Different details, but the same basic structure. Divine warning, one chosen survivor, preservation of life, catastrophic destruction of the old world. Arabian traditions from the pre-Islamic period contain similar stories. Folklore from coastal populations around the Persian Gulf repeatedly references ancient cities swallowed by the sea, prosperous lands that vanished beneath the waves, survivors who fled inland and founded new settlements. These aren't biblical retellings, they're indigenous traditions that predate Islam and Christianity in the region. Now here's where we need to talk about oral tradition and collective memory, because the standard academic response to flood myths has always been, yes, interesting stories, but they're just myths. Cultural narratives, not historical records, and that's true up to a point. Myths aren't documentary records. They change over time, they accumulate embellishments, they merge with other stories. But dismissing them entirely ignores something important. Oral traditions can preserve genuine historical information for remarkably long periods. Australian Aboriginal traditions contain stories about coastlines and islands that haven't existed for 7,000 to 10,000 years. Stories that recent underwater archaeology has confirmed as geographically accurate. Native American traditions from the Pacific Northwest contain detailed accounts of massive earthquakes and tsunamis that geologists have now dated to specific events in the historical record. Flood myths from the Black Sea region describe a catastrophic inundation that matches geological evidence of the Mediterranean breaking through and flooding a freshwater lake around 5600 BCE. The point is, oral traditions can preserve memories of actual events, especially catastrophic ones, for thousands of years. Not perfectly, not without distortion, but the core narrative, the basic facts of what happened, those can survive. So when we find flood narratives concentrated in the Persian Gulf region, all describing the same basic event, a sudden catastrophic inundation that destroyed an ancient civilization, we have to at least consider the possibility that they're remembering something real. Let's look at the common elements. First, the flood comes suddenly. It's not a gradual sea level rise. It's a catastrophe that happens within the lifetime of the survivors. This matches what we know about the Persian Gulf flooding, which would have been relatively rapid in human terms. Second, the flood is total from the survivors' perspective. The entire world is underwater. Now, obviously the entire planet wasn't flooded, but if you lived in the Persian Gulf basin and sea level rose 120 meters over a few centuries, your entire world would be underwater. Every settlement you knew, every landmark, every piece of coastline, gone. Third, survivors escape by boat or by fleeing to high ground. This is exactly what you'd expect from a marine transgression. People living on the coast would see the waters rising year by year, generation by generation. The smart ones would build boats or migrate inland. Fourth, the flood marks a civilizational reset. The world before the flood was different from the world after. This suggests the flooding didn't just displace people, it destroyed their entire way of life, forcing survivors to rebuild from scratch in new territories. Fifth, these survivors become the ancestors of the post-flood civilization. They carry knowledge and skills from the old world into the new. They're culture bearers, founders, legendary figures who rebuilt society after catastrophe. This pattern, refugees from a drowned land bringing civilization to their new homes, is exactly what we'd expect if the Persian Gulf basin had supported a significant population that was forced to migrate. Now, the scholarly debate about all this is fierce. Conservative archaeologists and historians argue that flood myths are just myths, universal narratives that cultures develop independently because floods are common and terrifying. They point out that flood stories exist in cultures all over the world, not just the Middle East. Therefore, the argument goes, they can't be referring to one specific event. But that argument has weaknesses. Yes, flood myths are common, but they're not all the same. Most flood myths from outside the Middle East describe local floods, rivers overflowing, coastal storms, regional disasters. The Mesopotamian flood tradition is different. It describes the destruction of the entire known world, the end of an era, the boundary between prehistory and history. And it's geographically specific. The stories consistently place the flood in the same region, the same area that geological evidence shows experienced rapid marine transgression around 8,000 years ago. Other scholars take a middle position. They acknowledge that the myths probably contain some historical kernel, but caution against reading them too literally. Yes, there might have been significant flooding in the Persian Gulf region. Yes, this might have displaced populations and been remembered in oral tradition. But the stories we have now are separated from any real event by thousands of years and multiple retellings. They've been mythologized, theologized, adapted to serve the ideological needs of later cultures. The gods and supernatural elements are later additions. The specific details, boat dimensions, bird releases might be borrowed from other traditions or invented for narrative purposes. What might be genuine is the core memory. Waters rose, lands were drowned, people fled. Civilization had to be rebuilt. This middle position is probably closest to the truth. The flood myths aren't documentary evidence, but they're not pure fiction either. They're cultural memories of a real catastrophe, passed down through oral tradition, gradually transformed into the mythological narratives we have today. Think about it this way. If the Persian Gulf basin really did support a thriving population 10,000 years ago, and if that population really was displaced by rising seas over the next 2,000 years, the survivors would have told their children about the old lands, about the fertile valleys and abundant resources that their ancestors had known, about how the waters came and everything was lost. Those children would tell their children. Generation after generation, the story would be passed down. With each retelling, some details would be lost, others would be embellished. The timeline would compress. A process that took centuries would be remembered as happening in days. Natural causes would be attributed to divine action, because that's how ancient people understood catastrophic events. But the core narrative would remain. Our homeland was drowned. We fled. We survived. We rebuilt. By the time the story was finally written down, 6,000 or 7,000 years after the event, it would have been transformed into something like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the biblical flood narrative, mythological in structure, but possibly historical in origin. And here's the really provocative question. If the flood myths are remembering the drowning of the Persian Gulf basin, what else might they be remembering? The Sumerian king list talks about cities that existed before the flood. 5 cities, each ruled by ancient kings. Are these memories of actual settlements that are now underwater? The myths describe pre-flood humanity as having achieved great things: agriculture, cities, civilization itself. Then the flood destroyed it all and survivors had to start over. What if that's basically true? What if the Gulf Basin populations had developed relatively advanced cultures, and when the flooding forced them to migrate, they brought those cultural achievements with them? What if the sudden appearance of agricultural civilizations in Mesopotamia, the seemingly rapid development from villages to cities, wasn't entirely independent invention? What if it was, at least partly, the result of displaced populations bringing knowledge and technologies from their drowned homeland? We can't prove this. Not yet. Not without extensive underwater archaeology in the Persian Gulf, but we can say this. The concentration of flood myths in the Middle East, their remarkable consistency, their geographical specificity, and their temporal alignment with known climate events make a compelling case that they're preserving genuine historical memory. Something catastrophic happened in this region around 8,000 years ago. Waters rose, lands were drowned, people were displaced, and the survivors remembered. They told stories. They built those stories into their foundational myths. They used them to explain where they came from and why the world was the way it was. Thousands of years later, when writing was finally invented, the first stories they bothered to record, the narratives they considered important enough to carve into permanent form, were about the flood. The great catastrophe that had ended the ancient world and begun the one they lived in. Maybe that's coincidence. Or maybe it's because the flood wasn't just a myth. Maybe it was the defining event of human prehistory in the Middle East. The disaster that shaped everything that came after. The memory that wouldn't die because it was too important, too fundamental, too central to understanding who they were and where they'd come from. The flood myths might be humanity's oldest historical records, imperfect, mythologized, transformed by millennia of retelling, but at their core still preserving the memory of the day the waters came and the old world drowned forever. So here's where the story gets really interesting, because unlike most lost civilizations that exist only in mythology and speculation, the Persian Gulf Flood left behind something concrete, evidence, real, tangible, physical proof sitting on the seabed 40 meters below the current waterline. The problem is, nobody's been able to properly look for it until very recently. Marine archaeology in the Persian Gulf is hard, not just difficult, challenging. We're talking about one of the most politically complex bodies of water on Earth. 6 different countries, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, Qatar, all with competing territorial claims and different levels of enthusiasm about foreign researchers poking around the continental shelves. Then there's the practical stuff. The Gulf is shallow, but it's also murky. Visibility is terrible. The water is warm and salty, which accelerates deterioration of organic materials. And there are strong currents that have been shifting sediment around for 8,000 years, burying some sites and exposing others in unpredictable ways. But despite all these challenges, we've started finding things, real things, things that shouldn't be where they are unless the flood hypothesis is correct. The first systematic underwater surveys began in the 1990s, mostly as side projects during offshore oil exploration. Companies drilling in the Gulf needed to survey the seabed, and their sonar equipment started picking up weird anomalies, shapes that looked too regular to be natural formations, lines that suggested human construction, concentrations of material that had different acoustic signatures than the surrounding seabed. Most of this data sat in corporate archives for years. Oil companies weren't particularly interested in archaeology. They were looking for hydrocarbons, not human settlements. But gradually, some of this information leaked to researchers, and what they saw was tantalizing. In 2008, a team led by Dr. Geoffrey Rose from the University of Birmingham began analysing bathymetric data, detailed maps of the Gulf floor. They weren't looking for specific sites. They were trying to reconstruct what the Gulf basin would have looked like when it was dry land. What they found was remarkable. The ancient landscape wasn't just a flat plain that happened to get flooded. It was complex. River valleys carved deep channels through the basin. High ground created natural settlement locations. There were areas that would have been perfect for human habitation, elevated positions near water sources with good visibility and access to multiple ecological zones. Then they started overlaying known archaeological sites from the surrounding coasts onto this reconstructed landscape. And patterns emerged. Sites that seemed randomly distributed when you looked at the modern coastline suddenly made perfect sense when you restored the ancient topography. They weren't coastal settlements at all, at least not originally. They were inland sites that had been positioned to exploit river valleys and resource-rich zones that are now underwater. This is what archaeologists call predictive modelling. You use environmental data to figure out where people probably lived. Then you go look there. And when Rose's team started identifying priority locations for underwater investigation, they found that some of them matched exactly with the sonar anomalies the oil companies had detected years earlier. But finding potentially interesting sites and actually investigating them are two very different things. Marine archaeology is expensive. You need specialized equipment, trained divers, research vessels, permits from multiple governments, and lots of time. Most importantly, you need funding. And convincing funding agencies to pay for underwater archaeology in the Persian Gulf, looking for a hypothetical civilization that might not even exist, that's a hard sell. So progress has been slow. frustratingly slow. But what we have found is compelling. In 2010, a Saudi-German team investigating shallow waters off the coast of Saudi Arabia discovered what appeared to be stone structures, walls or foundations, sitting in sediment layers that dated to the early Holocene, the period right after the flood. The structures themselves couldn't be directly dated, they're just stone, but the sediment layers above and below them provided a chronological bracket. More interesting than the structures themselves was their location. They were positioned on what had been high ground in the ancient landscape, exactly where you'd expect permanent settlements if people were living in the basin before the flood, and they showed evidence of deliberate construction, stones selected for size and shape, arranged in patterns that don't occur naturally. The team couldn't excavate fully, their permit was limited, but they brought up some stone tools from the site. Basic stuff, scrapers and blade cores, consistent with late Stone Age technology. Nothing spectacular on its own. But the fact that these tools were found in context with structural remains in a location that was predictably habitable before the flood, that's significant. Other discoveries have followed. Off the coast of Bahrain, divers have reported stone circles on the seabed, arrangements of large rocks that look suspiciously like the foundations of ancient structures. In Kuwaiti waters, fishermen have been pulling up worked stone and pottery fragments in their nets for decades, usually from specific locations that they now avoid because the nets get snagged on underwater obstructions. None of this is conclusive. Every single underwater find in the Gulf could potentially be explained away. Natural rock formations can look regular. Currents can concentrate artifacts from much later periods. Without proper excavation and dating, we're just collecting hints and possibilities. But here's what makes the underwater evidence so compelling. It matches perfectly with what we see on land. When you look at the archaeological record around the Gulf's current coastline, something weird happened right after the flood. Something that doesn't make sense unless there was a population that had been living in the basin before it flooded. Around 6,500 years ago, fully developed agricultural settlements suddenly appear along the newly formed coastline. Not primitive villages where people were just figuring out farming. Advanced communities with sophisticated irrigation systems, permanent architecture, and complex social organization. This is the Ubaid culture, one of the most important prehistoric cultures in the Middle East, and its origins are a complete mystery. Traditional archaeology says the Ubaid culture developed gradually from earlier cultures in the northern Mesopotamian region. But there's a problem with that theory. The earliest Ubaid sites in the north are actually younger than the earliest Ubaid sites in the south, near the Gulf Coast. The culture appears to have spread from south to north, from the coast inland, which is backwards from what you'd expect if it originated in the northern agricultural heartland. Even weirder, the earliest Ubaid coastal sites show a fully developed maritime adaptation. These people were expert seafarers from day one. They had sophisticated boats, advanced fishing technology, and trading networks that extended across the Gulf. They weren't learning maritime skills, they already had them. They also had something else, an architectural tradition that appears fully formed with no apparent antecedents. Ubaid houses follow a distinctive plan. Rectangular structures with a characteristic layout that remains consistent across hundreds of years and thousands of square miles. This isn't the kind of thing that develops overnight. Architectural traditions evolve slowly, with experimentation and regional variation, but Ubaid architecture appears suddenly, already standardized, as if the people building these houses were following a template they'd been using for generations. Then there's the pottery. Ubaid ceramics are incredibly distinctive. Fine, buff-coloured ware decorated with geometric patterns in dark paint. The technology required to produce this pottery is sophisticated, requiring careful control of clay preparation, firing temperatures and pigment application. The earliest Ubaid pottery is just as accomplished as later examples. There's no learning curve, no progression from crude attempts to refined techniques. These people already knew exactly what they were doing. Put all this together and you get a picture that makes much more sense if the Ubaid culture didn't originate in the region around the Gulf, but in the Gulf itself. What if the Ubaid people were refugees from the flooded basin? What if they were the survivors of a sophisticated maritime culture that had been living in the river valleys and coastal zones of the Gulf basin when the waters came? That would explain the sudden appearance of advanced maritime technology. They'd been using boats for millennia in the rivers and lakes of the basin. That would explain the standardized architecture. They were rebuilding the same house types they'd lived in before the flood. That would explain the sophisticated pottery. It was a technology they'd developed over many generations before the catastrophe forced them to relocate. It would even explain some of the weirder elements of Ubaid culture, like their burial practices. Ubaid people buried their dead in a distinctive way, in ceramic coffins, sometimes inside their houses. This isn't common in the ancient Middle East. But it makes perfect sense if these people had originally lived in a low-lying, potentially flood-prone environment where above-ground burial structures might get washed away. Burying your dead inside your house in waterproof ceramic containers, that's exactly what you'd do if you'd learned the hard way that floods can disturb cemeteries. The Ubaid people also had an unusual obsession with water management. Even their earlier settlements show evidence of sophisticated drainage systems, channels to direct rainwater, raised platforms to keep structures above flood level. Again, this seems excessive for communities living on relatively high ground along the Gulf Coast, unless they were traumatized by living through a catastrophic flood and were determined never to be caught unprepared again. But the most tantalizing evidence comes from Ubaid religious practices. They built temples, distinctive structures that became more elaborate over time but always followed the same basic plan. These temples were positioned on raised platforms, artificial hills built up from thousands of mud bricks, and many of them were associated with sacred pools or wells, water features that played a central role in religious rituals. Some researchers have suggested that Ubaid temples and their later Sumerian successors, the famous ziggurats, were deliberately built to resemble mountains. The story goes that these lowland people were imitating the mountain temples of their northern neighbours. But there's another interpretation. What if these artificial hills weren't imitating mountains? What if they were commemorating high ground? What if each raised temple platform was a memorial to the elevated places where their ancestors had taken refuge when the waters rose? And those sacred pools and wells might not have been about worshipping water gods. They might have been about remembering, about preserving the memory of when the waters came and changed everything, about teaching each generation that water is both life and death, that it can sustain you and destroy you, that you must respect it and plan for it and never ever forget what it can do. This is speculative, of course. We can't interview Ubaid priests and ask them what their temples meant. But when you look at the pattern of evidence, both underwater and on land, a coherent story emerges. A story of a sophisticated culture living in a rich, resource-dense environment. A culture that developed advanced maritime technology, established trading networks, created distinctive artistic and architectural traditions. Then catastrophe, a flood that came in stages, but ultimately forced them to abandon everything they'd built over millennia. survivors fleeing to the edges of their world, which became the new coastline, refugees establishing new settlements, bringing with them all the skills and knowledge and traditions of their lost homeland. The future of Persian Gulf archaeology could change everything. New remote sensing technologies are being developed that can peer through murky water and thick sediment. Autonomous underwater vehicles can survey vast areas without the expense of research vessels and dive teams. Most importantly, the political situation is slowly improving. Several Gulf states are becoming more interested in their ancient history and more willing to fund archaeological research. In the next decade, we might finally get comprehensive surveys of the priority areas Rose identified. We might excavate those stone structures off Saudi Arabia properly. We might find preserved organic materials, wood from ancient buildings, plant remains, maybe even textiles or basketry that can be directly radiocarbon dated and analysed. We might discover entire settlements, preserved under protective layers of sediment, waiting to tell us who lived there and what their world was like. The preservation conditions are actually better than you might think. Yes, the warm, salty water destroys organic material faster than cold, fresh water. But rapid burial in fine sediment can create anaerobic conditions that preserve things remarkably well. And unlike terrestrial sites that get ploughed, built over and disturbed by thousands of years of subsequent human activity, underwater sites just sit there, undisturbed, waiting. We might be on the edge of a major discovery, the kind that rewrites prehistory and forces us to reconsider how complex human cultures develop and spread. The evidence is down there, 40 meters below the surface, scattered across thousands of square kilometers of seabed. All we have to do is find it, document it, and be willing to accept what it tells us about a civilization that thrived, then vanished beneath the waves, leaving only legends and refugees behind. So the waters came. The Persian Gulf basin, with its grasslands and rivers and settlements, disappeared beneath the rising sea. But here's the thing about people. They don't just vanish when their homeland floods. They move, they scatter, they survive, and when they do, they take everything with them. Their knowledge, their technologies, their stories, their gods. The question isn't whether the people of the Gulf Basin survived. It's where they went and what they carried with them when they fled. Because if there was a substantial population living in that fertile basin when the waters rose, then sometime between 18,000 and 8,000 years ago, one of the largest mass migrations in prehistoric history occurred, and nobody wrote it down because writing hadn't been invented yet. But that doesn't mean it didn't leave traces. Let's think about the geography first. You're living in the Gulf Basin around 10,000 BCE. The waters are rising slowly but inexorably. Every generation sees the coastline creep further inland. Fishing grounds become submerged. River channels shift. Eventually, entire settlements have to be abandoned. Where do you go? You can't go south. That's where the water is coming from. You can't go east into the open ocean. That's suicide. Your options are north, northeast, and northwest. Up the river valleys that feed into the basin, following the Tigris and Euphrates northward into what would become Mesopotamia, tracking along the eastern coast toward what's now Iran, moving westward along the Arabian coastline toward the Levant. These weren't random wanderings. These were migration routes that had probably been used for thousands of years. Trade routes, hunting paths, seasonal movement corridors that connected the Gulf Basin to surrounding regions. When the floods came, these familiar paths became escape routes, and over the course of thousands of years, as the water level rose in stages, wave after wave of refugees would have followed them to higher ground. The archaeological record from this period shows exactly what you'd expect if this happened. Sudden increases in settlement density in the regions surrounding the Gulf, new sites appearing in Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Arabia. Population explosions that traditional models struggle to explain. It's like watching a sponge absorb water. The Gulf empties, and the surrounding territories suddenly fill up with people. The most obvious destination was Mesopotamia. Follow the Tigris and Euphrates north from the Gulf Basin, and you end up in the river valleys that would eventually host the world's first cities. The timing is remarkable. The Gulf flooding peaks around 8,000 years ago. The first agricultural settlements in Mesopotamia start appearing around 9,000 to 8,000 years ago. Sites like Tel Abu Huraira, Tut al-Huyuk, and the early layers of Jericho. These aren't scattered campsites. These are permanent settlements with sophisticated architecture, organized agriculture, and complex social structures. Now, standard archaeological theory attributes this sudden flowering of civilization to the Neolithic Revolution, the independent invention of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent. And maybe that's exactly what happened. But here's what bothers researchers who support the Gulf Oasis theory. Agriculture isn't simple. You don't just wake up one morning and decide to plant seeds. You need knowledge. Which plants are edible? Which ones can be cultivated? How do you select seeds for desired traits? When do you plant? How do you irrigate? How do you store surplus grain so it doesn't rot or get eaten by pests? This knowledge takes generations to develop through trial and error, unless someone already has it. Unless there was a population somewhere that had already figured out proto-agriculture, plant management, systematic harvesting, and storage. A population living in a rich, stable environment where they could experiment with cultivation without the constant pressure of survival. Then that population gets flooded out and has to move, and when they move, they bring their knowledge with them. The Gulf Basin would have been perfect for developing early agriculture. Fertile soil from river deposits, reliable water sources, mild climate, long growing seasons, rich plant diversity. If any population in the Middle East was going to figure out systematic plant cultivation before the Neolithic Revolution, it would have been the people living in that drowned paradise. So here's the theory. The Neolithic Revolution wasn't a single invention that spread from one center. It was the result of displaced Gulf populations arriving in Mesopotamia and the Levant carrying knowledge of plant cultivation, animal management, and settlement organization. When they integrated with local populations, they introduced these concepts, and suddenly, within a few thousand years, agriculture was everywhere in the Fertile Crescent. The evidence for this is circumstantial but intriguing. The earliest agricultural settlements in Mesopotamia show a level of sophistication that seems to appear almost fully formed. They're not crude first attempts. They're organized communities with standardized building techniques, systematic grain storage, and evidence of long-distance trade networks. It's like they're following a blueprint that already existed somewhere else. The Western migration route is equally fascinating. Moving along the Arabian coastline toward the Levant, Gulf refugees would have encountered regions that were themselves undergoing dramatic environmental changes. The Arabian Peninsula was drying out as the post-Ice Age climate shifted. The Levant was becoming wetter and more productive. It was the perfect time for incoming populations with advanced knowledge to establish themselves in these territories. And that's exactly what we see. Between 10,000 and 8,000 years ago, the Levant experiences a population boom. Sites like Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, start appearing around 9,000 BCE. These aren't simple hunting camps. Jericho had stone walls, organized housing, communal buildings. The people living there were practicing agriculture, domesticating animals, creating pottery and art. Where did this knowledge come from? Maybe it was invented locally. But maybe, just maybe, it came with refugees from the south. People who had lived in permanent settlements for generations in the Gulf Basin and knew how to build, farm and organize communities. When they arrived in the Levant and encountered local populations, they didn't conquer or displace. They integrated, sharing knowledge and technologies, creating the hybrid cultures that would eventually give rise to the great civilizations of the ancient Near East. The eastern migration route is less studied, but potentially just as important. Moving along, what's now the Iranian coast, Gulf populations would have encountered the Zagros Mountains and the highland regions of western Iran. This area also shows evidence of early agricultural development, particularly in sites associated with early goat and sheep domestication. Some researchers think the eastern migrants specialized in animal husbandry, while western migrants focused more on plant cultivation. The Gulf Basin would have supported both activities, and different refugee groups might have taken different knowledge sets with them depending on their specific backgrounds and the environments they encountered. Then there's the linguistic evidence. This is where things get really speculative, but also really interesting. The languages of the ancient Near East, Sumerian, Akkadian, Elamite, early Semitic languages, show some puzzling connections and even more puzzling isolation. Sumerian, the language of the first literate civilization in Mesopotamia, is a language isolate. It doesn't clearly relate to any language family we can identify. Some linguists think this suggests Sumerian came from a population that had been isolated for a very long time, possibly in a refuge area that protected them from the population movements and language mixing that affected surrounding regions. A refuge area like the Gulf Basin, which would have been geographically isolated by water and desert for thousands of years. When that refuge flooded and its inhabitants dispersed, they would have carried their language with them. If Sumerian-speaking refugees became the dominant cultural force in southern Mesopotamia, which is exactly where Sumerian civilization eventually emerged, that would explain why Sumerian is so different from surrounding languages. It's a linguistic fossil from the drowned Gulf oasis. The cultural evidence is even more suggestive. Early Mesopotamian mythology is obsessed with water, floods, and creation from primordial seas. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, describes the world being born from the mingling of fresh and salt water. The Epic of Gilgamesh includes the famous flood story. Sumerian myths frequently reference a primordial homeland, sometimes called Dilmun, sometimes other names, a paradise garden where the first people lived before being scattered. This could all be coincidence. Every culture has flood myths and creation stories. But the specific details in Mesopotamian mythology are striking. The emphasis on the transition from water to land, the memory of a lost homeland, the arrival of civilizing knowledge from somewhere else. It's exactly what you'd expect if the founding populations of Mesopotamia were descendants of Gulf refugees who maintained cultural memories of their drowned homeland. The same patterns appear in Arabian traditions. Pre-Islamic Arabian poetry and legend reference lost cities and vanished peoples. Later, Islamic scholars writing about Arabian prehistory mention ancient peoples who lived in great prosperity before being destroyed by flood or drought. These could be purely mythological, or they could be degraded memories of actual historical events passed down through generations. Now, let's talk about the practical impact of this diaspora on surrounding regions. When populations migrate, especially populations with advanced knowledge and technologies, They don't just move into empty territories, they interact with people already living there. Sometimes this interaction is violent. Sometimes it's cooperative. Usually it's both at different times and places. The Gulf refugees, if they existed, would have been entering regions occupied by hunter-gatherer populations who had lived there for thousands of years. These local populations had their own knowledge, their own survival strategies, their own territories and resources. The arrival of farmers and herders with different subsistence strategies would have created both opportunities and conflicts. In some regions, the interaction might have been relatively peaceful. Gulf refugees with agricultural knowledge arrive in a river valley already occupied by hunter-gatherers. Initially, there's tension. Resources are contested. But gradually the groups begin to interact. Hunter-gatherers provide knowledge of local plants, animals, and terrain. Refugees share cultivation techniques and settlement organization. Children from both groups intermarry. Within a few generations, you have a hybrid population combining the best survival strategies of both groups. This scenario explains something that puzzles archaeologists about the Neolithic revolution. It didn't happen all at once, and it didn't completely replace hunting and gathering immediately. For thousands of years, early agricultural populations also hunted and gathered. They maintained mixed economies, combining multiple subsistence strategies. This makes perfect sense if agriculture was introduced by migrants who had to learn from local populations how to survive in unfamiliar environments. In other regions, the interaction was probably more violent. When resources are scarce and territories are contested, conflict is inevitable. Archaeological evidence from the Neolithic transition shows increased violence in many areas. Fortified settlements, mass burials, skeletal trauma consistent with warfare. Some of this conflict was probably between incoming agricultural populations and resident hunter-gatherers. But violence isn't the whole story. It's probably not even most of the story. The genetic evidence from modern Middle Eastern populations shows incredible diversity, indicating mixing between multiple population groups over thousands of years. This doesn't happen if every interaction is warfare. It happens when populations interbreed, merge, and create new hybrid communities. The diaspora model also explains the remarkable speed of the Neolithic transition. Traditional models suggest agriculture was independently invented in multiple locations and then spread slowly through cultural diffusion. But the transition from hunter-gatherer to agricultural societies happened remarkably fast across the entire Fertile Crescent. Within just 2,000 to 3,000 years, agriculture went from barely existing to being the dominant subsistence strategy from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. That speed makes more sense if the transition wasn't about invention, but about migration. Multiple waves of agricultural refugees from the flooding Gulf basin, spreading into surrounding regions over thousands of years, each wave bringing knowledge and techniques, accelerating the adoption of farming wherever they settled. The implications are profound. If the Gulf Oasis theory is correct, then the Neolithic Revolution, the most important transition in human history, might not have been a revolution at all. It might have been a migration, a forced displacement of populations who carried with them the seeds, both literal and metaphorical, of civilization. And those displaced populations would have been the founders of the first great civilizations in human history, the Sumerians in southern Mesopotamia, the Elamites in western Iran, the early agricultural communities in the Levant, all potentially descended from refugees fleeing the rising waters of the Persian Gulf. We are, all of us, descendants of survivors of climate disasters, of floods and droughts, of ice ages and warming periods. The people of the Gulf Basin, if they existed, were survivors too. When their world drowned, they didn't give up. They adapted, moved, rebuilt. And in doing so, they might have seeded the entire civilized world with the knowledge that would transform humanity from scattered bands of foragers into the builders of cities, the writers of epics, the founders of empires. But the story doesn't end there, because what happened next would determine not just who survived, but who would inherit the future. So here's where we stand. There might have been an advanced Neolithic civilization living in the Persian Gulf basin for thousands of years. They might have developed agriculture, built settlements, created trade networks, all before anyone else in Mesopotamia. Then, around 8,000 years ago, the sea rose and swallowed everything. Their cities, their fields, their entire world disappeared under 300 feet of water. The survivors scattered, carrying their knowledge and technology to the surrounding coastlines, and within a few centuries civilization suddenly appeared in Mesopotamia, fully formed, with no apparent developmental period. If this is true, and that's still a big if, then we need to rewrite the entire narrative of how civilization began. Think about what we've been taught. The cradle of civilization is Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, the land between the rivers. Around 6,000 years ago, people in this region figured out agriculture, built the first cities, invented writing, and basically kicked off human civilization. Everything important happened there, in those river valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates. This narrative has shaped archaeology, anthropology, and our fundamental understanding of human development for over a century. It's in every textbook, every museum display, every documentary about ancient history. Mesopotamia first, then Egypt, then the Indus Valley, then China. The story of civilization spreading gradually from its birthplace in the Middle East. But what if that's wrong? What if Mesopotamia wasn't the beginning, but the continuation? What if the Sumerians, those mysterious people who appeared in southern Iraq with their complex society already developed, weren't inventing civilization from scratch? What if they were refugees, survivors, people trying to rebuild what their ancestors had lost when the waters rose? This changes everything. The problem with the traditional narrative is that it's always had holes, big ones. The Sumerians themselves said they came from somewhere else, a place they called Dilmun, a paradise that lay to the south and east. Archaeologists have always struggled to explain where the Sumerians came from. They appear in the archaeological record suddenly, with sophisticated architecture, complex social organization, advanced agriculture, and a fully developed writing system. There's no clear developmental period, no obvious precursor sites showing the gradual evolution of these technologies. It's like they downloaded civilization from somewhere and hit the ground running. Mainstream archaeology has tried to fill this gap. Maybe their precursor sites are buried under later settlements. Maybe they developed somewhere else and migrated into Mesopotamia. Maybe the development happened faster than we think. But none of these explanations has ever been fully satisfying, because the evidence just doesn't support a gradual local development of Sumerian civilization. Now, consider the Gulf Oasis hypothesis. Suddenly those holes make sense. The Sumerians appear suddenly because they were refugees from a flooded civilization. They have no developmental period in Mesopotamia because their development happened somewhere else, in settlements now 300 feet underwater. They have sophisticated agriculture from day one because their ancestors had been farming for thousands of years in the Gulf Basin. They know how to build cities because they'd built cities before, cities that are now archaeological sites on the bottom of the Persian Gulf. The Dilmun their texts describe as a paradise to the south and east. That's not mythology. That's memory. cultural memory of the homeland their ancestors lost when the waters came. This hypothesis would make the Persian Gulf oasis the true cradle of civilization, with Mesopotamia being the first chapter of the story we can still read, but not the actual beginning. The beginning is underwater, waiting to be discovered. But here's what makes this theory both exciting and problematic. We can't prove it, not yet. Not without extensive underwater archaeology in the Persian Gulf, and that's incredibly difficult to do. The Gulf is shallow, but it's huge, about 240,000 square kilometers. Finding specific archaeological sites in that much underwater territory is like searching for particular grains of sand on a beach. Underwater archaeology is expensive, time-consuming, and technically challenging. You need specialized equipment, trained personnel, significant funding, and cooperation from multiple countries whose territorial waters cover the Gulf. Even if you find promising sites, excavating them underwater is exponentially harder than excavating on land. Everything takes longer, costs more, and requires specialized techniques. You can't just dig a trench and start sifting through layers. You need diving teams, underwater survey equipment, methods for excavating and preserving artifacts in saltwater conditions. And after 8,000 years underwater, organic materials would be long gone. Wood, leather, textiles, even bone might not survive. You'd be looking for stone foundations, ceramic fragments, potentially metal objects if they developed metallurgy. The very things that would prove this was an advanced civilization are the things least likely to survive millennia of saltwater immersion. So the evidence we need is probably down there, but getting it is incredibly difficult. That said, some researchers are trying. Recent surveys have identified promising anomalies on the Gulf floor, unusual geometric patterns that could be ancient settlements, concentrations of worked stone in areas that would have been prime habitation sites when the Gulf was dry. Nothing conclusive yet, but enough to suggest that if we could mount a major archaeological expedition, we might find something remarkable. The question is whether the international community will invest the resources needed to find out. Because this isn't just about one lost civilization, it's about fundamentally changing how we understand human development. And the implications go way beyond the Persian Gulf. If there was an advanced civilization in the Gulf that got wiped out by rising seas, then we need to be looking for other lost civilizations in other areas that flooded after the Ice Age. And there are a lot of those areas. During the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago, sea levels were about 400 feet lower than today. Huge areas that are now underwater were prime real estate. The land between Southeast Asia and Australia, called Sundaland, was a vast tropical landscape, bigger than India. The entire area is now under the South China Sea, the Java Sea, and the waters around Indonesia. If people were living there, and they almost certainly were, then rising seas would have swallowed thousands of years of human history. The same is true for Beringia, the land bridge between Asia and North America, for the drowned river valleys along the coasts of every continent, for the continental shelves that are now 200 feet underwater, but were once coastal plains where people probably lived. We've been doing archaeology on land for 2 centuries. We've barely started doing archaeology underwater, and we've almost completely ignored the vast areas of continental shelf that were above water during the Ice Age but are now submerged. What if we're missing half the story of human civilization because we've only been looking in half the places people actually lived? Some researchers think we might be missing more than half. Graham Hancock, who's popularized the idea of lost Ice Age civilizations, argues that nearly all the best real estate during the Ice Age is now underwater, and that's exactly where we should be looking for advanced prehistoric cultures. Now, Hancock's theories are controversial and many archaeologists think he goes too far in his claims. But his basic point that we're ignoring underwater sites is hard to argue with. The Persian Gulf oasis is just the most developed version of this hypothesis because the geology and archaeology line up so well. But the same logic applies to dozens of other flooded landscapes around the world. Rising seas didn't just change coastlines, they erased entire worlds, and we've barely begun to understand what we lost. This brings us to the most sobering implication of the Gulf Flood hypothesis. It's not just about what happened 8,000 years ago, it's about what could happen again. Because here's the thing, climate change and rising seas didn't stop after the Ice Age, they're still happening. Faster now than at almost any point in the last 10,000 years, not as fast as during the catastrophic meltwater pulses that might have created the Gulf Flood, but fast enough to threaten every coastal city on the planet. Current projections suggest sea levels could rise 2 to 6 feet by 2100, depending on how fast polar ice melts. That might not sound like much compared to the 300 feet that flooded the Gulf, but it doesn't take much to devastate modern coastal infrastructure. A 6-foot rise would flood significant portions of Miami, New Orleans, Shanghai, Mumbai, Bangkok, and dozens of other major cities. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people displaced, trillions of dollars in infrastructure lost, entire ways of life erased just like the Gulf Oasis culture was erased 8,000 years ago. And unlike the people of the Gulf Oasis, we can see it coming. They had no warning. One generation, the sea was at one level. The next generation, it was higher. The next generation, higher still. They probably didn't understand what was happening or why. They just knew the water kept coming and they had to keep moving. We understand exactly what's happening and why. We have the data. We have the projections. We know which cities are most vulnerable and when they'll start experiencing regular flooding. We know how much carbon we need to reduce to slow the process. We know what's at stake. The question is whether we'll act or whether we'll just watch our own civilizations drown, like the people of the Gulf Oasis watched theirs. The parallels are uncomfortable. An advanced, prosperous culture living in a prime location. People who'd built something remarkable over thousands of years. Then environmental change they couldn't control, or maybe didn't understand until it was too late. And within a few generations, everything they'd built was gone. Survived only in the memories and scattered remnants carried by refugees. That story might be about to repeat itself, just on a much larger scale. But there's also hope in this story, because the people of the Gulf Oasis survived. They lost their homeland, their cities, probably most of their population, but enough of them made it to the shores to rebuild, to pass on their knowledge, to seed new civilizations that eventually flourished and spread. They were resilient. They adapted. They found a way forward even after losing everything. We might need to do the same thing. Not necessarily fleeing rising waters, though some coastal populations will have to relocate, but adapting to a changing world, rebuilding systems that aren't working, creating new approaches to old problems. The story of the Gulf Flood is ultimately a story about human resilience in the face of catastrophic environmental change, and that's a story we might need to remember in the decades ahead. But we still have so many questions. Was there really an advanced civilization in the Gulf, or are we seeing patterns that aren't really there? If there was, how advanced were they really? Did they have writing, metallurgy, complex architecture, or were they sophisticated hunter-gatherers and early farmers without cities at all? Where exactly did the survivors go? Can we trace specific cultural elements from the drowned Gulf sites to later Mesopotamian settlements? Are there genetic markers that could confirm migration patterns? Most importantly, can we find and excavate underwater sites that would prove or disprove this hypothesis once and for all? These questions remain unanswered, and they might remain unanswered for decades unless there's a major commitment to underwater archaeology in the Persian Gulf. But the hypothesis exists now. It's been proposed, refined, connected to geological and archaeological evidence. It can't be ignored anymore. Mainstream archaeology is slowly coming around to taking it seriously, not as proven fact, but as a legitimate hypothesis worth investigating. That's how science works. Someone proposes an idea, others test it, and gradually we figure out what's actually true. The Persian Gulf oasis hypothesis might be completely wrong. Maybe the Sumerians really did develop in Mesopotamia, and we just haven't found the early sites yet. Maybe the Gulf was inhabited, but only by small groups of nomadic hunter-gatherers, not urban civilizations. Maybe the flood stories are just coincidental, mythology that developed independently without historical basis. But maybe not. Maybe there really was a forgotten world under those waters, a civilization that thrived for millennia and then drowned, a culture whose survivors seeded Mesopotamian civilization and whose memory survived in flood legends told around fires for 8,000 years. Maybe we're about to discover that human civilization is older, more complex, and more resilient than we ever imagined. And maybe, just maybe, remembering what happened to them will help us figure out what to do about the waters rising around our own cities, our own civilization, our own world that's changing faster than we can keep up. The story of the Gulf Flood isn't just about the past, it's about the future too, about what we lose when we ignore environmental warnings, about what we save when we choose to adapt instead of denying reality. The people of the Gulf Oasis didn't have a choice. The waters came and they had to deal with it. We still have time to choose. The question is, what will decide? So here we are at the end of our journey. We started with a mystery, a vast underwater plain at the bottom of the Persian Gulf, and we followed it backward through time, back through the rising waters, back through 8,000 years of flooding, back to a world that no longer exists, a world where what is now seafloor was once a river valley stretching for hundreds of miles, where fresh water flowed year-round and grassland supported herds of animals, where people, your distant ancestors, might have built communities that we'll never see. Because here's the thing about lost civilizations. They're not just about ruins and artifacts. They're about possibilities. Every sunken coastline, every drowned valley, every landscape that disappeared beneath the waves represents thousands of years of human experience that we can't access. Stories that were never written down. Technologies that were never preserved. Ways of living that vanished without a trace when the waters rose. The Persian Gulf Flood wasn't unique. It happened all over the world as the ice sheets melted. The Black Sea flooded catastrophically around 5,600 BCE, drowning vast territories in a matter of decades. The North Sea swallowed Doggerland, a landscape that had supported human populations for thousands of years. The coasts of every continent retreated inland, consuming settlements, resources, and the accumulated knowledge of countless generations. But the Gulf might have been special, not because the flooding was worse, but because of what was there before the flood. A 35,000 square mile oasis in an otherwise harsh region. A place where early humans might have developed sophisticated adaptations to riverine life, where they might have experimented with plant cultivation earlier than anywhere else, where population densities might have been higher than the scattered hunter-gatherer bands we typically associate with this period. We'll probably never know for sure. The evidence is under 300 feet of water and buried beneath thousands of years of marine sediments. Excavating underwater sites is phenomenally expensive and technically challenging. The Persian Gulf, with its oil infrastructure and geopolitical complexities, isn't exactly welcoming to large-scale archaeological expeditions. But that doesn't mean we should stop looking. Every year, new technologies make underwater archaeology more feasible. High-resolution sonar mapping can now identify structures on the seafloor that would have been invisible a decade ago. Remote-operated vehicles can collect samples and document sites without requiring human divers. Genetic analysis of modern populations can track ancient migrations with increasing precision. And here's what makes this important. It's not just about satisfying curiosity, though that alone would be worthwhile. It's about understanding who we are and where we came from. Every time we discover a lost civilization, every time we push back the timeline of human achievement, every time we find evidence that our ancestors were more sophisticated than we thought, we rewrite the story of humanity. For too long, we've assumed that civilization was a recent invention, that humans were primitive and unchanging for hundreds of thousands of years, until suddenly, around 10,000 years ago, we figured out agriculture and everything changed. But the evidence keeps challenging that narrative. The archaeological record shows increasing complexity, not sudden revolution. Sophistication that developed gradually over tens of thousands of years, not overnight. The Persian Gulf Flood survivors, if they existed, were part of that story. They were people who had already adapted to changing environments, who had developed strategies for living in marginal landscapes, who understood how to exploit riverine resources effectively. When the waters rose and they were forced to migrate, they carried that knowledge with them. They became part of the broader human story, contributing genes and ideas to the populations that would eventually build the first cities in Mesopotamia. We're all products of these forgotten migrations, all descendants of populations that survived climate disasters we can barely imagine. The same resilience that carried humans through the genetic bottleneck 900,000 years ago carried them through the post-glacial flooding. The same adaptability that allowed our ancestors to spread across 3 continents and become multiple species allowed their descendants to survive the drowning of their homelands and build new lives in unfamiliar territories. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, think about those submerged valleys. Think about the communities that might have thrived there, the children who played along those ancient riverbanks, the innovations that might have been developed and then lost when the waters came. Think about how much of human history is hidden, waiting to be discovered, stories that might never be told but that shaped everything that came after. If you've enjoyed this journey into the deep past, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a like if this helped you relax, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from, and subscribe if you want more explorations of forgotten history. Your support helps keep these stories alive. The past is vast and mostly unknown, but every mystery we investigate, every question we ask, every possibility we consider, brings us closer to understanding the full story of human resilience and adaptation. Sleep well and dream of ancient rivers beneath modern seas.